Thank you, Michael. I'm really moved by this introduction. I don't know if I would ever think of these exact words for myself, but I'll describe myself like this from now on when I'm asked. So thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak about the book that I just received today. I'd like to pass it around so that you can check it, and here are some postcards, so feel free. So I'm very happy to come back to the Cooper Union and share the work that I've been doing over the past 4 years on this project that was originally an exhibition and later on it became a publication. Because I'm here and because people like narratives and stories to kind of delve into the context of one's work, I'll start with a story. And this story is somewhere between fiction and reality. And it's a very common day, a day like any other. On November 2016, basically when we found out that the elections were won by Donald Trump. I'm actually having to figure out only one thing. How do I change the slides and speak from there? It might be, is it okay if I sit? Yeah? There's another closed world which is here, so I hope it doesn't break during the lecture. But I think we'll be fine. Okay. All right, so I'll present to you the book that I've just handed around, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? And I'm starting with a story, a very common and trite day on November 2016. Winter has suddenly arrived and outside it snows. I am inside, airtight, and connected to the world. Inside, I breathe my own exhalations while reading news of dismay over the US elections and respire to make patterns on my super-insulated window. Just seeing the condensation dripping assures me that I'm unaffected from the cold as well as the political disarray in Washington. I see the city steadily freezing, yet my own sphere is warm, cozy, and equipped with power and Wi-Fi. Sinking might be more useful for survival than food. Looking behind the walls, where everything happens, I recollect Rainer Banham's words. My home is not a house. It is a labyrinth of noisy heated ductwork. Pipes and wires sustain my voluntary detachment from the visceral, raw, and dirty urban space and forge my total immersion in electronic information trends. My atmosphere is fully recycled by heavyweight infrastructure that I cannot see, nor would I wish to see. If I could add plants to these pipes and root soil hydroponically, perhaps my hallucination of unaffectedness from the climate change, from fierce political ruptures, could be prolonged. IKEA's homegrown program offers some distraction from the ongoing newsfeed. Now anyone can grow a garden inside, and my plan is to grow vegetables and tomatoes, feeding them with my own shit. Inside my microcosm, my safe replica of an unsafe world, the living and the manufactured have been intertwined to secure a compound geochemical affinity between capital and excrement. The purpose of this supersystem, this egosphere, as Peter Sloterdijk would call it, is to nurture other complexities, me. Do I personify the contemporary human subject that is blissfully distant from all that matters, yet entirely immersed in a carefully curated replication or reverberation of the world? Life cannot get any denser inside my own bubble. And of course, this kind of trite story is nothing new. The world in a bottle is nothing new to architects. In fact, architecture's role in the reconstruction of idealized microcosms is tied to the convoluted history of Utopia. And here we see a very famous Utopia, one that is very closely connected to the context of the book, Buckminster Fuller and Soji Sadow's Dome over Manhattan. And we can also recall Banham's environmental bubble, or House Rucker Coe's, this project, A Piece of Nature, Ein Stück Natur, that was presented in the 1970s in an art fair in Cologne. These samples are iconic illustrations of a period of a very intense environmental anxiety, very close to the oil crisis, and precisely because they manifest like jarred fossils, like in a fishbowl, our lost idea of the untamed land. What might resonate with our climate today, however, is that the containment is not explicitly environmental. It is not simply a regulation of climate and air quality. Closed worlds ensure the preservation of civic interactions, living patterns, and urbanity in an imagined, curated stage set extruded from reality. All animate and inanimate bodies are coded by networks of exchange and subsumed into urban production. Climate is directed along with protocols of trade and civic interactions. One of the things I'm trying to argue in the book is that closed worlds is no longer a poetic metaphor. It is no longer tied to the history of Utopia, but it has become profitably real. It might be committed to a deeply rooted fantasy of architecture producing nature, yet it is fully integrated within the fabric of reality. In many ways, all buildings and large chunks of cities are atmospheric collectives that define enclosures. Our indoor environments today are in fact politically charged spaces that reflect social ideas and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Because data and measurements in environmental control offer trustworthy and convincing mediums and illustrations, they have attained tremendous power and influence, which has been maintained and circulated, even though in most cases these types of criteria institutionalize many absurd principles. The manipulation of organic and ecological processes confined in artificial enclosures have become metaphors for enforcing cultural and biased standards of life by recalling the power of data and cultural capital. So in the book, overall I argue that the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering has been closely linked to the conceptualization and production of closed systems. They're partial reconstructions of the world in space and time. Closed systems speak of the eerie transference of life using architecture as the medium and vessel to secure a compulsive cycling of matter, energy, and data. The projects documented in the book represent entirely different and antithetical political ideologies and very different agendas. They range from military experiments to countercultural practices and the nostalgia of the homesteaded housing movement, to more recently the dubious concept of ecological tourism and environmental capitalism. In all cases, the systems are real. They have all been built and tested, and they're invested in the strangeness of the real. They are experimentally implemented rather than based upon speculation, so they're definitely not utopias. They reveal to us the strangeness of the world that we live in and possibly challenge what we consider to be sustainable. In order to help you get into the context of the book, I'm going to show 4 case studies, which is something that the book does. It really presents an archive of 37 living prototypes and tries to weave their stories together. So I'm going to show you 4, and I'm going to start by this one because it is the one that has a greenhouse and it's very famous. The Climatron in 1960. And the rise of botanical capital. That's the theme and the story related to this prototype. So the Missouri Botanical Gardens was the first air-conditioned hemispherical greenhouse that used a data center to control its mechanical air supply, hydration systems, and lighting, even to control bird calls. It's known through the term Climatron, and it was designed by St. Louis architects Murphy and Mackey, along with Thomas Howard, a guy that used to work for Buckminster Fuller and later inherited his dome enterprise called Synergetics in 1958. In addition to displaying more than 15,000 tropical plants inside a non-native environment, the Climatron housed an artificial miniature mountain a Himalayan mist forest, a waterfall, an aquarium, lily ponds, and a swamp. To achieve this very carefully curated natural stage set, the mechanical engineers, Paul Lund and Associates, designed 2 different airstreams to counter the real climate of the area, to counter the effects of summer and winter. Buckminster Fuller visited the facility in 1964, and his presence in the media was ubiquitous. However, he did not design the climatron, contrary to the opinion of many historians. The guy that was actually behind the scenes and designed the climatron was a plant pathologist and horticulturalist called Fritz Wendt, who was the garden's director and the inventor of the climatron concept. Wendt envisioned a public botanical showcase, a spectacle, with a controlled but varied atmosphere for research, a place where a dozen climates could range from steaming jungles to cool mountains and coexist in a single great room. He controlled the garden by this machine, the Honeywell data center, known as the climatron's brain. Information was fed to the brain by a nerve system of thermostats and humidistats, constantly checking each climate area and making continual corrections to the climatron's air conditioning streams. The brain had a lot of other operations that Wendt could supervise. You could push a button to turn on a rainstorm. You could turn on 100,000 watt banks of floodlights for a day of a blistering sunshine. You could also turn on bird calls to give visitors an audible impression of a jungle. It was very much an administered scenery that was apt not just for the growth of plants, but also for an entertaining, embodied experience within a savage, unspoiled natural world. So the climatron is important not only because of its infrastructural facility, of the fact that plants were controlled by these machines in 1960, but also because it was the first facility to capitalize on sensorial immersion into a primitive, humid vegetal world taken from the jungle, almost like a prophylactic from the dirty urban landscape, which are the words that Wendt used. Prior to his work at the climatron, Wendt used to work at the California Institute of Technology since the 1930s, where he developed the idea of a phytotron. And in quotes, this was a fully air-conditioned environment for the growing of commercial crops that maintained constant temperature and humidity levels in response to the pollution of urban environment, end quote. The phytotron demonstrated that plants placed inside the sealed unified environment would grow better than plants that would grow in the variable atmosphere of a city, a position that remains one of the most controversial and contested legacies of high modern biology. Wendt essentially, what he advocated for with this facility was the homogenization of the atmosphere and for the construction of a sealed enclosure that would build and maintain pure atmospheres of constancy where plants and humans could flourish in their comfort zones without any deviations from established atmospheric norms. Now, in the 50s, it was very much a desired challenge for engineers to create a thermal equilibrium in interior comfort zones in narrow ranges. This desire reflected the modern body as a tool in a constant atmospheric medium in order to control and predict its behavior and growth. These efforts were not systematized until later in the 1980s, following the oil crisis and the introduction of the sealed building interior that would prevent energy loss. In the 90s, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, ASRAHI, determined that certain combinations of air temperature, relative humidity, air motion, and mean radiant temperature resulted in what most people consider thermal comfort. Now, it is precisely this mechanical vision of biology that gives life specifically a modern character, and this is one of the arguments of French philosopher and physician Georges Canguilhem. If organisms, either people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures serving a physical equilibrium, one cannot account for the complexity or the beauty of life. Independently, the climatron is far, and these are some of the charts that engineers would do in the 50s that all air conditioning companies use today, called the psychrometric charts. Now, one of the interests in this book is that history is not really history that stays in the past, but it is not a historical example, but something that is revived today. And this is the new headquarters of Amazon that just opened its doors a few months ago in downtown Seattle, which is called Amazon Biospheres, exclusively to be used by Amazon employees to secure higher productivity levels for workers. To create this jungle type of office tree, which is what the architects that worked on this project, NBBJ architects, argued for, Amazon hired full-time a horticulturalist, this guy, Ron Galliardo, to safeguard the biodiversity and well-being of plant growth, and they were growing these plants for years until they would be moved to the headquarters. The company has also invested, along with the $4 billion headquarters, in augmented brain development, according to the presence of people close to vegetal life. So they have a lot of statistics that argue that if you control the atmosphere, you control the kind of level of productivity of their workers. At the same time, this project that is very famous, and it's the Eden Project by Grimshaw Architects in Cornwall, England, altered the regional economy of the region and contributed over £1 billion to the Cornish economy. Since 2000, as Tim Smith argues, that is Eden's executive vice chairman and co-founder, Eden represents a lost world by manifesting, literally, the loss of the Earth's biodiversity. Eden, however, neither combats climate change nor provides a toolkit of architectural precautions. It is not a performative piece of architecture. What it successfully does is to construct an impressive stage set for our loss encased in a bubble, like a souvenir. Based on Eden's income, Smith popularized a term that has been used since, ecological capitalism, a term that indicates not necessarily the capitalization of nature, but the capitalization of our sense of loss of nature that has become eventually a stepping stone for the development of new economies. So having shown this example, I'm moving on to something very, very different. The prototype for a master-slave between 1956 and 1972, an anthropomorphic machine. It is basically a man-machine integration prototype where closure becomes a communication prototype, not necessarily the sealing of a space, but it is illustrated through the idea of circular feedback, circular communication feedback. And to help you introduce into these types of projects, I will start by a famous image. It was used by John McHale in several of his publications. This is Cornell's Aeronautical Laboratory exoskeletal harness system. It was developed by Cornell Laboratory, and it was used by McHale in several of his publications for a cover of Architectural Design Quarterly, inside an AD issue that he edited in 1967, and also in his famous book, The Future of the Future, in 1969. This image showcases both a system of excessive technological ornamentation, but also it illustrates a solid feedback loop. In the mechanical armature, motor impulses from nerves and muscles are picked up and fed to artificial muscles, and the devices correspond to the body's own nervous system. So it is not an autonomous system, but one that reads the responses of the bodily nervous system and augments the body's performance and makes the body stronger beyond its physical limitations, hence the term that McHale invented for these types of prototypes called Men Plus. Now, the bonding of men and machine in a closed circuit represents an entire genealogy of experiments for man-machine integration under the rubric of a very strange term called master-slave. This contentious term has been used since the 1950s for anthropomorphic manipulator systems and later on for computer networking. In a US patent that you see on the screen, that was filed by NASA in 1972. The slave is a mechanical replica of the master's body and armature, designed to carry big loads and endure all possible injury, with virtually no consequence to the user. The term at some point was banned by the County of Los Angeles and subsequently the Global Language Monitor because it was egregious and offensive. Absolutely. But if we strip away the term from the terminology any ethical and political meaning, we might find a story of melancholy and deep anxiety as much as one of mechanized authority. And let me show you an example to prove that. This is one of the master-slave anthropomorphic manipulator machines, an early version called Yes Man. The inventor was General Electric's American engineer called Ralph Mosher, that moves hazardous radioactive materials, but also becomes the mirror image for a dexterous and polite slave helping a lady into her coat. Behind the scenes, however, he's very distressed, and you can see him struggling here, because the effort it takes to control his slave is extreme and very, very painful. In the closed world of the master and slave, Mosher engineered a feature that he called force feedback, using sensors in the robot's pinchers and arms to pick up and relay stress and eventually to restore a tactile sense to the operator as a recourse of his actions. So the person controlling the slave would feel the effects of his own actions onto his body. Following the Yes Man prototype, Mosher pioneered an extensive investigation of cybernetic anthropomorphous machines, called CAMs, as master-slave manipulator projects at General Electric from the 50s to the 70s, including Handyman in 1958. Then you see here the Pediculator, a walking machine, in 1962, the four-legged walking truck in 1969, and Hardyman between 1965 and 1971. In all cases, Mosher developed robotic prototypes with extra limbs that would be directly tied to the human nervous system rather than operate autonomously. Mosher envisioned this type of union, our neurons translated into kinesis, as a kind of wedding. Man and machine were combined in an intimate unit that performed as one wedded system. And the wedding was further consummated by the feature of force feedback, feeding back the level of force to the human operator. Along with this key feature, it was critical that the machines not only mirrored the actions of men, but also looked like men. It was vital to represent with wires and connections the delicate nervous systems as translated into servomechanical functions. Anthropomorphism was proof of concept for these engineers. General Electric's press release for their specialty materials handling and productions divisions said, quote, "The systems are cybernetic because man is retained in them and his brain is used to provide the computer function. An additional result of the intimate marriage of man and machine was that the machines are usually man-like or anthropomorphic in form, although the machine you're seeing today resembles a very dexterous elephant other than a man." GE hired this industrial designer, Earl Stewart, to work closely with Mosher in order to direct the architectural form of the master-slave prototypes. In the machine series, the architecture took on the form of the inner working of things, the guts or the circuitry, and the tubes that materialize all the necessary connections. They exposed, in a very intentional and purposeful way, plumbing and circuitry, and developed an aesthetic proposition from the performance of circulation and system feedback loops. The lurking image equivalent to this requisition is Banham's famous environmental bubble, and the Baroque of mechanical gadgetry that he proposed with François Delegray. This is the big dog. This is the kind of legacy that of the CAMs that we see today by Boston Dynamics, that was recently purchased by Google. And the same kind of aesthetic proposition of all the wires exposed is the same, but they removed the feature of force feedback. This prototype, along with its predecessors that I have shown to you, illustrate a type of environmental expressionism that is still endeared as proof of concept, even if the machines do not work that well. In many projects, there is no intent to mimic nature formally or functionally, but to expose the mechanical and chemical viscera of ecosystems and buildings. And of course, this is something that is proven through the history of architecture, not just CAMs from the Pompidou onward to many other buildings. Considering today's ubiquity of different genres and machine learning with big data and responsive system, the master-slave devices exhibit little, if no, computational intelligence, that is, intelligence by machines with a learning capacity. Although referenced as reconnaissance robots, Amazon flying drones that are expected to invade our skies by 2020, Big Dog and MarkBot, what you have just seen, are controlled by a master user in a linear chain of commands. Each master-slave machine might be limited in its operational intelligence. Nevertheless, as Benjamin Bratton suggests, it is the vastness of their pervasion, spinning out of control on their own, that might in fact form the body of an accidental global megastructure. This replicate body of the master and slave envisions a world entirely based on mediation, both between individuals and with space. Our constantly connected existence allows individuals to affirm themselves by augmenting their containment as something simultaneously interiorizing and exteriorizing. Even though the master-slave model reflects and even materializes an absurdity of self-love, it is perhaps the truest version we have of human nature and its absence. And with that, I'm moving to something again very, very different, the prototype of Epcot, between 1966 and 1982, and the architecture of compulsive happiness. And the man behind it is no other than Walt Disney, who I actually hate, but anyway. But he's very important to the experiment of the closed world because he designed in 1966 his dream project, Epcot, which is an abbreviation for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Epcot was basically a controlled, sanitized, and protected circular city, providing not only a new theme park of entertainment and leisure, but new living patterns for what he called happy dwellers. Disney really believed that happiness could be designed through technology, and more specifically, by regulating pollution, trash, ventilation, and electricity to offer, comfort, leisure to happy dwellers. The Disney ideal offered uncomplicated, wholesome entertainment inside Disney's own pre-engineered fantasy. And you see here an audience dispossessed by Mickey Mouse, which was an idea that was as much a closed world as much as the physical city that he proposed at Epcot. Epcot, when it came out in 1966, has been largely critiqued for subsuming the history of Utopia, from Claude Nicolas Ledoux to Ebenezer Howard, from the American City Beautiful movement of the 1890s to Victor Grant's urban models, along with the added benefits of improving air quality and weather comfort. It was a living laboratory, as he called it, and a technology showroom for future cities, just at the time when cities throughout the world were decaying and disintegrating. In Epcot, each house would have its own fuels connected to a centralized waste collection system, water supply system, and living farm using swamplands and filtering plants. The city was also connected via this machine, the monorail running through the center and tying all parts of the property. But most importantly, it was meant to be enclosed in a climate-controlled dome, and this is one of the mock-ups that Disney used, literally copying Bucky Fuller's project. It has been largely critiqued by architectural critics at that time. Here is one critique from Roy Landau in A.D., Mickey Mouse the Dictator, because he was interested basically in controlling human emotions through the sovereignty of territory and in the pursuit of happiness as a game of managing comfort and human physiology. This perception of life as a feedback loop of input and output, as the process of combustion and oxidation, was widespread in the design of the spacesuit as a life support system at the time, which is something that Disney was very much interested in, and some of the early films are about astronauts and other planets, and in the understanding of trauma following the war. In fact, Jewish psychiatrist and neurologist Viktor Frankl, in his best-selling book Man's Search for Meaning, written after his stay at a Nazi concentration camp, argued that the difference between those who had lived and those who had died came down to one thing: their ability to find meaning in the most trivial, repetitive, and mechanical tasks of life. In his own words, happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue, and could in fact ensue from the meaning of sustaining life through a series of problem-solving challenges. Likewise, and these are very much system feedback loops for the astronaut's main loop, kind of making very visible the presence of problem-solving tasks, which is transferred to the design of the built environment from a general idea of problem-solving and leveraging life support and energy flows. Accordingly, the most important invention of Epcot was this facility, the utilidors, which was a series of underground networks for the control of pollution, and called utilidors. An underground network of tunnels contained a series of systems to handle the waste in the park that the park produced. This is something that is currently used. It was used at Roosevelt Island. So in Roosevelt Island, there used to be no cars, and all the trash was regulated by underground tunnels. So it was transferred directly from this facility to Roosevelt Island as an experiment at that time. Still, what is significant to observe is how the language of environmental representation since the 1960s, especially with the dissemination of biologist Howard Odom's energy systems language called Energess, has instrumentalized ecosystems as well as human agency in terms of input and output. This representational language for ecological simulation models, derivative from electronic circuits, has become the primary tool for architects to visualize performance and energy flow almost exclusively through the use of arrows. This is something directly inherited from electronic circuits to architectural design. And it is likewise, Epcot's diagrams for the recycling of renewable resources reveal a larger problem of deduction in environmental representation. With the dissemination of these diagrams, environmental concerns have been normalized to a circular form of reasoning, obscuring the illustration of loss, derailment, and the production of new substances and atmospheres, that is, the density of living systems, forcing it to exist into a mechanical flow paradigm. This type of information deduction was an ongoing anxiety for Chilean biologist Francisco Varela, who argued in his book The Embodied Mind, following his known work on autopieces along with Humberto Maturana, that cognitive systems cannot be understood explicitly based on their input-output relationships, but by their operational closure. A system that has operational closure is one in which the results of its processes are those processes themselves. The brain, Varela argues, uses processes that change themselves while operating, and thus we cannot separate such processes from the products they produce. Similarly, the language of environmental representation represents processes while these processes are trying to develop a relationship with themselves. In the environment, performance is seen as a cognitive process formation hypothesis, not as a simple prescription or reflection of a pre-given piece of information. Returning to Epcot, to Disney's disillusionment, the project never came to fruition. He died 2 months after he presented the project, and his brother Roy Disney oversaw the completion, changing it to an entertainment leisure park famously known as Disney World. Nevertheless, it is still an autonomous world of its own, governed by internal rules and regulations, sometimes to its detriment. A year ago, a toddler was snatched by a crocodile inside the premises of the safe haven, a testament to the instability and unpredictability of the self-organizing nature of closed worlds. Individual things may die, but what will forever live is the collective life of the system, the aggregate community of the thriving closed world as a species of its own. And this is the last example that I will share with you. It is actually the most famous one in the book, Biosphere 2. It's still, I visited it this year, and it remains one of the largest and most famous closed ecological systems ever built. Its purpose was to test the viability of a biologically regenerative artificial environment in order to support human habitation in space and to provide a prototype of an Earth colony in case the Earth would be destroyed. It was built by Space Biospheres Venture, a partnership between Ed Bass, a businessman and philanthropist, and John Allen, a systems ecologist and environmentalist. Bass spent approximately $200 million to build and sustain the facility, and it supported 2 missions, with the first team of researchers entering the facility in 1991, locked from the exterior world for 2 years and 20 minutes. The team produced their own food, they produced their own air supply, and during the entire experiment, all of the crew's waste, including waste from their domesticated animals, was recycled through natural, low-tech filtration methods. What this facility is very famous for is its failure. It failed spectacularly and publicly, and it became a public failure spectacle. The first mission was notorious for technical and operational failures, especially for not creating enough oxygen. After 6 months, oxygen absorption by raw concrete that was still curing had depleted oxygen levels in the facility by 6%. Along with the poor quality of the air inside, unanticipated species called crazy ants flourished and thrived, and the biospherians hungered from hunger throughout the 2 years of their residency. Each of them lost about 1/3 of their body fat. Well, maybe I should go there after this baby. But anyway, the second mission became infamous for mutiny and public feuds among different stakeholders involved in the facility's management. In time, John Allen, who was the figure of the philosopher-scientist, came to battle with Ed Bass, the financier, the guy who provided the money, basically. The latter camp claimed that Allen and his synergists were destroying the credibility of the project, that they were a cult, with Bass taking action in hiring the controversial white nationalist that many of you might know, Stephen Bannon, to run Space Biosphere Ventures. The involvement of Bannon, who was at the time manager of Bannon & Co. investment banking in Beverly Hills, was detrimental to the project. Of course it would have been. But anyway, with Bass and Bannon's endorsement, the second team of biospherians who entered the facility in 1994 were ambushed by federal marshals. The 2 men had concluded that the founding management team, including Allen and his cult, needed to go. In retaliation, Allen's scientists sabotaged the second experiment, and they opened the airlocks of Biosphere 2, claiming concern over the health of the inhabitants. They ruined the second experiment, and they were later arrested. The mission was compromised, and it ended soon thereafter. Bannon also had an open quarrel with biospherian Abigail Ailing, originally published in Tucson Citizen in 1996. And it was a debate that resurfaced in the media during the U.S. presidential elections of 2016. It disclosed a series of threats, insults, and accusations of harassment. Arguably, The closed world's material problems, evident in the first mission, were rendered as social and political problems in the second manned mission. Both events revealed that isolating and reproducing an arbitrarily chosen part of the Earth's biosphere, complex in structure and rich in diversity of species, does not reach equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium of material exchange in the system cannot set in spontaneously. Redundancy of species and the logic of inclusiveness did not automatically lead to the cybernetic equilibrium that Allen so earnestly desired. The battle between Allen and Bass exposes another dichotomy in environmental politics, that between the idealization of self-organization as an idea and the brutality of Darwinian evolution, which was transposed quite effortlessly to social order and policy. In many ways, Biosphere 2 exhibits a mythology of a consensus based on natural principles and furthers the belief that equilibrium should be translated to social policy and societal values. As a living experiment, the Biosphere 2 demonstrated that the limits of sustainability and the risks associated with closed ecosystems remain largely unknown. Even though ecosystems are mostly portrayed in several simulations that we have for buildings today as robust circular systems, where waste equals food in a series of cycles, the idea of self-sufficiency is compulsive and hysteric in the will to continually generate new life from all wasteful cycles of production. And this is how we structure our built environment. A closed world, along with its dwellers, is a new type of unbalanced ecosystemic model susceptible to the shortcomings of digestion. All substances and fluids are ingested and excreted in a non-stop process of material conversions. What remains a paradox is the manner in which this questionable model, imbued with the vitalism of a digestive stomach, has prevailed as the mainstream model of what we now call a sustainable net zero habitat opposing energy loss. In this light, it is critical to question to what degree resource conservation strategies are sustainable forms of practice, and also recognize how impossible ideas become institutionalized through a series of bureaucratic mechanisms that are eventually labeled as eco-friendly or even worse, as green. Now, overall, the case studies that I presented today ask simple questions. How are sustainable terms developed and institutionalized? How do they become tropes to signal new political ideologies, always expressing the left and the right at the same time? Veiled under the ethics of environmentalism, a new agenda has become the norm. Net zero, ecological footprint, minimizing energy loss through sealing, loop systems, and other terms are now a new form of capital. Closed worlds, in many ways, disclose a struggle of reconciling two utopian ideas. The first, of replicating the Earth in its totality, with the visceral and raw reality of stuff unexpectedly generated from feedback loops. Somewhere between the idealization of the world as a whole, as a complete and interconnected system, and the messy and fuzzy leftovers of human physiology lies an unexplored history of architecture that I tried to document in this book. The question I would like to leave you, though, today with is whether this is a deviant story of architectural history. And I believe it is not. It is a story that reflects the modern human subject, which is immersed in a carefully curated replication or reverberation of the world as a pre-engineered fantasy. Inside the unimaginable carcass of bits and fragments of information that we have to deal with every day in our lives, the only way to navigate, possibly, is relative to oneself, or, as French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux has put it, in a relational loss with context. Our need for embeddedness in the world and the ecosystem might already be obsolete. In psychoanalysis, this closure corresponds to an ontogenetic and phylogenetic stage of development, the stage of the protopsyche, at which the organism has control over nothing but itself, denying any environmental input as well as discharging output. In some ways, it becomes its own self-referential reality. In this new world, we are possibly in dire need of a new kind of criticism, new ways to fathom with ideas of interiorization, and methods to break barriers in the way that we narrate stories through the design of our environments, as well as the shaping of our reality. If every bit of fact is designed in the world of post-truth, the role of the architect, even though we didn't plan it as such, has expanded to more than shaping the physical world and the aesthetic and experiential aptitudes of our daily existence. In many ways, it has become of civilizational value. Possibly the mythic stories of closed worlds and their disobedience, burdened by their visceral flaws, might be a viable counterpart to an alternative deviant future. Thank you. Questions?
I have an observation. Utopias from the very beginning were awful. They always were awful. They were always dystopian. In fact, and they were always, very interesting enough, when they were narratives that were posed literally side by side with the narratives that opposed them. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, when Plato develops his republic, which is a closed world, absolutely governed by philosophers who control the world of everything, he also talks about the thriving and messy democracy of Athens, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of interpenetration of the two, even in the narrative there. Thomas More the same. Mm-hmm. When Thomas More does his two books, the first book is The Hell of England, the second book is The Hell of Utopia. So there's always this counter between the absolutely closed world of the utopia and the absolutely open and messy world of nature, physiology, and mankind, right? But if you actually read the utopia itself in its narrative, it's continuously questioned by, attacked by, and developed through its failure.
Yes.
And I find this is exactly. So in a strange way, I don't think there's an opposition between utopia and something else, right? Some non-utopia. I think utopia itself is the kind of idealistic program that we live messily in. So that we can't pull them apart in that way.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I love this comment, and you're absolutely right. And in a way, it is much more of like a genealogy of technological utopias, right? Of technological utopias. And in the book, I write for each project all the failures to illustrate how the history of failure is consistent in each project. But and of course, the struggle that you mentioned is present in all of the experiments. What is possibly interesting is how the projects that I've documented were materialized, all of them. And not only are they materialized, they're built and tested and applied, but also they're becoming part of an investment strategy of large corporations and large facilities to create these engineered fantasies worldwide. And it's part of the build, it's a very major part of the built environment. So it is trying to continue this story, but to say we're building it. We're building it, and we're basing all of our principles on what is sustainable on this very ancient struggle and this pre-engineered fantasy. So it's very much a critique, the book, I think, as much as it is providing information and kind of revealing all the kind of stories behind the scenes of each project and who was behind it and what were the ideas and what they were trying to accomplish. I think overall it's revealing this consistency of, you know, us wanting to build this utopia with the utmost technological instrumentation.
But your starting with the Trump election is absolutely extraordinary, because here you have the Trump world, which is completely to do with letting every kind of disaster happen.
Yes.
And pushing towards disaster, letting everything, taking out all controls, right? Which is totally inhabited and funded by the world of Amazon, Google, and the rest. So you have these two worlds which are totally supporting each other.
Yes.
And completely complicit.
I think that what I find really fascinating in your book, I think, their lecture, because I haven't read the book yet, I just browsed through it, is the different issues that you bring together, that you articulate, but they're actually more articulate. I think they're interwoven, which is certainly it's a striving for power. Every one of them is about
Yes,
power.
yes, absolutely.
But together with that, you have the very old fantasies of what power as a political power, economic power. But then there's a fantasy of power, the power of man. You go back to Leonardo,
Yes.
so trying to fly. So we get these reenacted and reenacted. But what I find fascinating is that you put inside all this the importance of the whole systems approach. And I find that, because it interests me, but I find that fascinating because I think it's essential in terms of a change in paradigm when this was developed with the war, Second World War, and after. And there was a different approach in terms of power, conquest, and technology, and the enactment of what was supposed to be utopia or vision or whatever into the real technology, right? With all these new philosophy and mathematical, scientific developments. And I think you managed to bring this through these 4 discrete, I would say, cases, right? They're not necessary, but I'm finding through the selection that you made of these, that articulation between these issues, and I find that really fascinating.
It's such a perceptive reading. I think that when my next book which I'm preparing now, is called A Not So Whole Earth Catalog, which is precisely what you reference, the kind of utopia that resurges after the war, and the idea of whole systems, basically, and our will and desire to read the world as such. So a lot of them are about that. It's more about our desire to read the world as such rather than what it is. And one of the things I'm interested in is confronting the raw reality of the reports, the engineering reports, with the kind of incessant desire to create these types of systems. But I think what you mentioned is a struggle that is evident in all of the projects that are documented in the book. And I think we're still battling with this kind of idea today in the way that we understand environmental concerns and environmental problems, because the reality is that environmental concerns are still addressed through the kind of desire for seamless integration with a natural setting, for minimizing destructive environmental footprint, based on, let's say, the book Cradle to Cradle, which was published in 2000, which promotes the idea that waste equals food, is one of the founding, it exemplifies these types of principles. And this is how environmental problems and concerns are.
Well, that if you get the good guys.
Yeah.
The reality is that a lot of the environmental questions, as they're, it's again the double system, because the reality is that all the solutions
Yes.
are creating more
Yes.
environmental problems than the original ones, right? And they're in the hands of
Yes.
profit-making and mega corporations.
Exactly.
You know, so I'm very skeptical about.
Absolutely, me too. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I'm very skeptical. But and I one of the in another textbook that I wrote last year for Oxford Encyclopedia, I wrote the history of ecological design, and the third section was dark naturalism, which was kind of outlining all of these ideas that countered these goodness, let's say. But I think the people that express these other ideas that you and I might be more interested in are really grounded in theoretical questions and philosophical questions and haven't transgressed into prototypes and practice and building yet. Timothy Morton, Donna Haraway, Jane Bennett, all of these writers that are kind of advocating that nature has ended already a very low.
Well, I think they're different. I think there's a big difference between Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway.
Absolutely.
Totally
Absolutely.
different.
Are you coming to dinner? We can discuss that. Maybe.
I don't know what's the difference.
But thank you. This was a great comment.
I am continually struck. I mean, it's at one level when you go and you see a presentation by somebody who's trying to transfer ecological and sustainable thinking into dollars, to see the circular diagram of arrows that everything's going to be happy and smooth, and I'm going to take this out and put it back in, and it's going back in, and it's coming back out. All right, so that has a power in kind of simplicity and idealism in promoting the expenditure of capital to become invested in that dream. But I see it used all the time in academic settings too, and by people who should be smarter.
You mean for non-environmental problems?
For arguments for sustainability within a more academic and intellectual argument. And I think one of the interesting things with bringing in Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway, as different as they are, is they don't yet have that kind of nugget of impact that has gained an articulation outside of philosophical discourse. Whether it's built or not is a different thing. For them to kind of counter the naivete of this circular arrow that is continually cycling and being good in of itself. And maybe this is that diagram, and maybe this is the one we need to send to them.
Well, Donna Haraway says, get on with the trouble. Just go with the trouble.
Go with the trouble.
Stay with the trouble.
Be a cycle.
And the shit.
Yeah.
She says, I'm a compostist, not a post-humanist.
But it's,
Until she can no longer breathe. Or she drowns. Right? So that's a real problem.
are there questions from students? I've told my students, by the way, they have to ask questions. So
Oh, this student wanted, you wanted to ask something. No? Did I put you on the spot? No, sorry.
I'm not a student, but I
Shoot.
You know, first of all, thank you. I mean, it was fascinating, and I can't wait to read the other examples of the book. You chose today to show us 4 American examples that sort of went in line really with the
Yeah,
topic.
that's a bad call. I realize that right now.
No, on the contrary, I think it's made the theme quite coherent, cohesive, and continuous, and also a bit frightening
Yeah.
about really the reality of this country, and actually really made me understand
Why we are where we are.
Exactly, and actually, just as you were bringing up Steve Bannon, I thought to myself, these are projects that Trump would have probably supported, each and every one of them. And
No, it wasn't the golf course.
sorry,
It wasn't the
it
golf
wasn't a golf
course.
course. Yeah, well, he could have found. I
That's
think
true.
He could have put one probably even in the jungle.
Yeah.
But the question is, in your book, have you found another, perhaps more humanist propositions, and perhaps?
I swapped the last case study, which originally I was showing an ecological house that was in England by a left-wing anarchist called Graham Kane, that used to study at the AA. So a lot of the projects in the book aren't like, they range. So what I was interested in, the migration of ideas. I didn't show any of that, and I think that's not a good call. Like next lecture, I'll put one of these in. Because a lot of the projects in the book are homesteading movement, ecological communities, both in England, other countries, and also recent projects by the space program like Mars 500, the Melissa project, which is an extraordinary coalition of the European Space Agency that they're estimating to finish in 150 years from now, and they've already been working on it for 35. So there's a very wide range of projects, and none of them, the ones I showed, align with what you say. I think it's also because I'm desperately trying to understand why we are where we are and what happened. And intuitively, I selected these American projects to really see the kind of foresight into a closed world of a political and cultural climate that we're part of. But in the reality is that the book doesn't only stop there. It goes to show all of these other projects, and one of the things I was interested in is the migration of the same kind of prescription of how you define a system to represent entirely different antithetical political ideologies, right? So how can an anarchist from outside of London and Werner von Braun, that was an ex-Nazi that was working for NASA and wanted to kind of shoot rockets to the moon, how could they have the same kinds of tools to be working with, and why they were espousing? Because Kane was reading the papers of NASA to build his house, and I was very interested in this kind of strange relationships between countercultural practices and military experiments, and the seamless migration of these types of ideas to express the left and the right simultaneously.
Well, I think a lot of these, many of these ideas actually have originated with the industry of war.
With
The war industry.
Yeah, the war industry. Yeah, absolutely.
Scientifically and technologically.
Absolutely.
Look what happened to the bucket full of dome when it went into Drop City, right? I mean, it became
Exactly.
a cardboard igloo
Yeah.
for dropouts.
Exactly. So these migrations are very interesting to track and witness and discuss.
Where do you put Arcosanti? I really dislike profoundly that project.
I didn't put it because I just couldn't get to the spiritual, the spiritual aspect. Just like turned me. It is.
It's almost anti-technological, right?
Yes, it was, but in a way it was. There was something about spiritualism, and I didn't want to put that into the game. I thought the soup was already it had too many ingredients that I didn't want to put spiritualism in there. I mean,
because you say, how come such different ideologies,
Yes.
According to the memoir recently published by his daughter,
Yeah, that's
Oh,
right.
yeah.
In my mind,
Solari's
that's exactly, because it was an
spiritualism
article.
was a kind of manic desire to dominate.
Of course, it's
To
not,
yeah.
it dominates
Dictate.
everybody's life.
It was a dictator. It was a dictator.
So
It
it's
was a
about power and control.
big pot being dictated by somebody who wanted
And
to
the documentary
control
his daughter
all
revealed
the
it?
potters,
Well, it
his
came
daughter.
back to my mind. I didn't read the article, but I read there was something. Arcosanti is not somebody, Soleri is not somebody that I particularly feel any affinity with or sympathy for, architecture or otherwise. But it was precisely a closed system where he wanted to kind
Yeah.
of control of entire society, like so.
Yeah.
Because you talk about closed systems, it came back to my mind.
Yes.
Into this other naive also approach that you could manage, in this
Yeah.
other way through
Yeah.
these other means that are not
Frank
necessarily
Lloyd Wright,
the heavy technology approach.
Taliesin
Tell me his name.
is the model actually that Soleri took. cult community.
A student has a question.
Um,
Hi.
There were a lot of photographs and drawings, but I noticed not many models. And I wonder maybe what you think about models as constructions, partial constructions of the outside world, or speculative constructions of a closed world on their own. I mean, I'm just wondering what you're thinking.
That's a very good question. I think, and this is just a very intuitive reaction to your question, all of these experiments were built. So the experiment was the living model, in a way. And they weren't, I mean, in architecture there's a modality of practice, and the model is a representation of a larger physical reality canonically, right? Canonically. It's not that it should be. But because these were types of experimentations, like, and a lot of them were done not necessarily by architects, but also by engineers, by inventors, by horticulturalists, by an interdisciplinary group of people, I think there were living models. Like, there were smaller sections of living models that were testing a part of the whole, but then it was directly built. So one of the things that was interesting to me in doing this book, and I did think about it, was that the sequence of representation that we have, that we take for granted in the way that we think, draw, operate as architects, was completely reversed, and there was a more direct path to action. So the model was never really, in none of these projects, a representation of a reality. It was the reality itself that mattered, the raw physical version of whether something worked or didn't work, and how it would be implemented one-to-one. That was the model itself. And I haven't cognitively said that in the book. I think it's a really good point that you're putting on the table. But I assume that would be an answer to your question, that there was no given linearity in the way that something would be thought of, represented, executed, but that path kind of, it became like a Mobius strip in a way, and a lot of things were done simultaneously, but the models became the life of things, and the actual prototype that failed or operated or worked in parts. Yeah?
Can you tell me more about who are the people that are still very interested in this ecological utopia nowadays? Because I'm thinking about myself, I feel that utopia is very cheap and easy to get now, because there's this virtual reality, and I'm making design every day, and each of them is a utopia for me myself. So who are those people?
Who are those people?
That care about,
Okay, yeah. Another very good question. Well, I think it's. Do you know that they're replicating the Eden Project in China?
No.
They are, and it's basically investment companies, entertainment, venture capitalists, developers. That are trying to kind of create destinations, and architecture plays along that game, obviously. So if you think of a place like the Dubai Ski Center, do you know? Have you heard of this? Which is in it's in the Emirates somewhere. I don't know exactly. I haven't visited. But if you think of this place, if you think of which creates an artificial mountain and a ski resort and a kind of interior environment that people can become part of this kind of fake entertainment experience. These are some people that would put in a very big amount of capital to create such a project. The Eden Project was so successful, and I visited that last year. I went to England. There were thousands of people. There were concerts. I was amazed to see what kind of a tourist destination it was. for people observing plants just to feel differently inside a controlled atmosphere. And they're replicating that in China because China has very high levels of pollution right now. Shanghai gives daily reports about the air pollution to citizens. And they're replicating that facility enlarged by 10 times. I don't remember which area, but they're definitely doing that. And then you can think of I even have malls in the book. I have like a few malls, and I'm speaking about hyper-reality and this kind of postmodern spectacle in the 1980s. So definitely this is something that goes on, but at the same time, it is, you have Elon Musk, the SpaceX, you have all of this effort to go to Mars. The European Space Agency is highly invested in the Melissa project. And these are not just projects that are the concerns of astronomers and microbiologists. They're definitely creating principles of energy flows and how to handle energy production and food crops and generation that are migrating into the building industry very quickly. So you wouldn't necessarily think that an architect or an architectural firm would be interested in such a question, but when Grimshaw was asked to design this new facility that was 20 times bigger, they have to invest in it, right? When Amazon decided that they want to do their headquarters and they went to NBBJ architects, it had to become part of their agenda. So I think that there's a kind of widespread interest, but it's not explicitly coming from architects, but it is very much part of the built environment and development. Yes?
I have one quick question about the Utopia and kind of this, I don't know, if you can start to enter the digital world, and I mean like in relation to VR and stuff like that, and if that's something that's happening now or something you've been looking at or something that has been attempted, if you can start to enter into the digital Utopia.
Yeah, well, in the exhibition that I curated at a storefront maybe 2 years ago, there was a VR experiment by one of the professors that teaches here, Farzan. Yes, he did a VR experiment. So I thought when I saw the proposal for the exhibition that it was interesting that this kind of augmented reality, VR reality, and the fact that we look at the world through our phones right now, and our perception of the built environment is so fragmented, and this kind of fragmented attention span has become a kind of new modality of life and a perception of knowledge. I was very much interested in VR. I'm not sure. It is part of it, but definitely the VR is an entirely autonomous world, and I became less and less interested in this type of experiment than the actual physical raw reality, although it is something that at the very beginning when I started working on these research projects I was interested in very much. I don't know if that answers your question or if it's like too legitimate. I don't have like a philosophical answer as to virtual reality, but yes. Yes.
Piggybacking off of the other conversations that have been had, would you consider, with regards to the model that these kinds of closed worlds come out of, and in their interrelation with VC funding, developers, and also the kind of scientific inputs and outputs, would you consider the spreadsheet to be a very important model, financial model, the kind of testing grounds for the space where computations are done, big data itself as kind of aspects of these closed worlds, and statistics and predictability is kind of the basis for the material realities, more so than maybe the arrows themselves?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point. I mean, are you on Facebook?
Mhm.
Do you feel that, algorithms like really change the modality in which you operate virtually, right? They change your algorithm and you interact with different people, so it is creating a kind of sense of asphyxiation virtually. So I think that's a very, very important question. It's not just, and this is what I was trying to get to, but I don't know if I successfully did it. A closed world is not just about energy, materials, and resources. It's also about a modality of operating within a system that has a perimeter, and what information goes in and out, and how a system is restructured by processing its own feedback, basically. I think that's a hugely important question, and online, the kind of underlying code becomes the ingredient of a closed world. Just like you have a tomato, a vitamin, and a food crop that can become a closed world in the phytotron, you have numbers and Excel sheets and spreadsheets that can become the ingredient of this other kind of world. And in social media, you do see that very evidently and very, very clearly. And I think it really curates your experience. The problem is that, and some people that do coding and are experts in coding were saying that in our generation, because we're old, right? We were interested in coding and in figuring out how things would work and tinkering with the system and the code. And the new generation is interested in using the system rather than manipulating the kind of underlayers of the system. And if you want to change a reality, you have to work with these underlayers as well. And it's very similar. It's almost like an analogy. If you go to the Biosphere, the project the last project that I've shown, there's the Biosphere, which is this artificial swamps and lakes and oceans. And below that, there's an endless series of tubes and channels and handling units called the technosphere, which is this underlying reality that enables this kind of fake thing to happen. And in many ways, I feel like a lot of social media are very similar to that kind of model, through code and through algorithms, and they give us a very ready-made, benign version of what we are to interact with, promoted by a rhetoric which is for my daughter who's 4, about goodness and sharing information, exchange, and freedom. So it's a very conspicuous. I think this is where, as architects, we can intervene, because we realize a section, right? We see things that aren't people from other disciplines aren't able to see, because in the biosphere, if you just draw a section, you can see the world above and the world below, and you can understand that the world above is sustained by the technosphere and how that is a revelation, basically. And such is the case with the design of social media as well. So this is why at the end, like I was trying, I'm interested, I guess, in too many things, but this is why I think that as architects we have capacities to see and to understand through our perception of space, drawing many different realities at once. And it's important that we enable this type of perception to more than just buildings.
Yeah.